Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, ecological, and political crises that we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week was Chris Smaje. Chris is a former academic. He was a lecturer in sociology. He has degrees in everything under the sun and is also the author of Small Farm Future. Chris is so concerned about food systems and communities and land politics and the economy and all of the systems thinking that we have regularly on this show, that like more than a few other guests, his solution has been to return to the land, create a small farm, feed his community, and try to educate other people how to do so, because he firmly believes that the relocalization of food systems is the only way to tackle an increasingly fragile international global food system. As we've seen with Russia and Ukraine, it was much more fragile than people assumed. But also it is part of the solution to the climate crisis, and it is part of the solution to politics and to economy and to fed up people who have been urbanized and disconnected from their communities, from where their food comes from what it is to be human, quite frankly. Chris is absolutely fascinating. He blends in this conversation population, climate change, the energy transition, politics, political economy, culture, health, and ultimately, of course, we spend a lot of time talking about power, the power systems that extract resources, and how to increase autonomy in communities. There's a lot to learn in this episode. I hope you all enjoy it. If you do enjoy it, please share it far and wide. If you're loving the show, support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com or on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. And a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community who keep this project going. Chris, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
You're very welcome. Yeah, nice to be here.
Nice to meet you, finally, because I've heard a lot about your work. So could you give a little bit of background about how where you've come from and how you kind of landed on this small farm as a means of saving the world?
Well, I don't know if I present it as a means of saving the world. I suppose part of where I'm coming from is that, there is no kind of single, there isn't a kind of single blueprint. There's no kind of, magic answer to the problems we're in. But yeah, I mean, my background was, I was a social scientist, basically, studied anthropology, sociology, social policy, worked in academia for a few years, and then I guess I had a sort of early onset midlife crisis in the 1990s, and I guess that was a time when people were beginning to talk about climate change as a big thing, and sort of energy transitions, and the food system sort of struck me as something that was a real kind of crunch point in all of that. Cut a long story short, my wife and I bought like an 18-acre parcel of land here in Somerset, northeast Somerset, in southwest England, gradually started trying to turn it into a small farm. We set up a little veg box scheme, a little market garden, horticulture, I think, and local horticulture is big in all of this. But yeah, so for a few years, I sort of focused just on growing and setting up the farm. But I guess that sort of confronts you with the global economy and the global food system in quite a sort of personal, tangible way. And I sort of began to kind of get back a little bit into some of the sort of social science around this. Why is it so hard to create a kind of vibrant local food system? What are the bigger forces involved in that? And sort of, going back to the saving the world thing, you get a lot of kind of off the peg solutionism, sort of both in the mainstream world. It's all about GM crops, or fermenting new type, precision fermentation or whatever. But also in the alternative farming world, you get quite a lot of that solutionism. It's all about, perennial grain crops or, whatever it might be. And I suppose part of my writing is that,
Yeah.
there's no, there's always trade-offs, there's always pros and cons, and it's kind of about steering our way through that. So I don't like to present my own farming as in some way the answer. And I think, we're all kind of stuck in, a sort of big dysfunctional systems in one way or another. But I do think, we need to really urgently be sort of changing the narrative and rethinking how we do things, because, there are some big crises in which we're enmeshed. And so, yeah, I wrote in the book, A Small Farm Future, the first part of it, I talk about 10 crises that we are facing that, I think are just going to upend our world in many ways. And that's that's sort of where I come into this in terms of, we've got a lot of rethinking to do.
Shall we go through those 10?
We could do. I'll see if I can remember what what they all are. I mean, there's a kind of the sort of logical drift. I talk a bit about population because, that's a really complicated issue, and people always say, well, the elephant in the room is population. So I try and deal with that first. But then the drift is kind of from biophysical crises. Climate change, I think, is clearly a critical one. Energy transition, can we transition into low carbon forms of energy and expect to continue having the kind of cheap and abundant energy that that we're used to, in certainly in the rich countries? And then, things like water, soil, materials. But then in the later part, I kind of get into, those I think are the sort of immediate proximal factors that drive a lot of debate in sort of environmental issues. But underlying that, I think, are deeper aspects of politics and economics. And, I've got a long section on political economy, I call it, which is what the old original economists, the likes of Adam Smith and David Ricardo called it before we forgot that the economy is actually political in modern times. And then a sort of cultural crisis, because ultimately this is about, who are we as individuals or communities or as a species? What is life about? How do we relate to the wider world? So I talk a little bit about that. So that's the structure of the first part of the book.
Excellent. Let's go through some of them, because I mean, population is something that hasn't necessarily been discussed on this show actually a lot. And I think it is most applicable when thinking about food systems and food systems collapsing.
Right.
Because I mean, I think it's kind of almost like a cul-de-sac of an argument, because, well, unless people want to commit genocide against different peoples, the population is what it is, and we have to figure out how to support it.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to figure out how to support it continuing growing as well, probably. How do the food systems that we have currently support or don't support population? Because I read an interesting thing recently that was like 70 to 80% of the world's food still comes from small farmers.
Yeah.
Like, industrial agriculture gets so much airtime, but actually it's not efficient or effective, and it's not really feeding anybody.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, that figure is a little bit controversial, and, some people push back against it a bit. But I mean, I think the way you frame the question is right, though. I mean, firstly, the population is what it is. It will continue to grow, but at a slower rate, and may drop off. Of course, if we get it wrong, it may drop off very alarmingly, and that's what that's a real disaster from all sorts of points of view. But again, it's partly this proximal versus underlying thing. The reason that the global population has got so large is it's driven by a whole bunch of these factors about the sort of modernization of the political economy, and that's what we need to be looking at to address these things. But yeah, you're right with the food system. I mean, and this is what I talk about in part 2 of the book. There's 4 parts to the book. I talk about this in part 2, is that we have really kind of put all our eggs in one basket, to use an agricultural metaphor, in terms of a kind of global food system that's very reliant on a small number of crops and a small number of livestock, less importantly. But, there's basically something like 75% of global cropland grows just 10 crops, most of which are cereals and, a couple of legumes. And, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't grow those crops. The reason we grow them in such numbers is because they tick a lot of boxes and they're great crops. But, one of the issues with them is that they're very processable, very transportable, easy to mechanize. And so we've built this huge and I think very non-resilient global food system based on a kind of specializing agriculturally, whatever you can sort of produce. Well, I talk about Ricardo's notion of comparative advantage in the book. Maybe we don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but
Could you explain it quickly?
Well, I mean, the idea is that it's best to specialize it's best for a country or a region to specialize in what it can produce most efficiently, and that if we then all kind of trade these things with each other, that sort of generates greatest human benefit. But that is on the basis of all sorts of assumptions that don't really hold true. And that's kind of what I argue in the book, is that, ironically, we've developed this global food system that produces very small numbers of crops, using a lot of energy, basically a lot of fossil energy. And it produces it at kind of cheap prices, cheap wholesale or cheap checkout prices. But it doesn't actually benefit people greatly. It doesn't benefit our health because we're eating too much of, these sort of high carb, high protein crops. It doesn't benefit poor people because essentially there's kind of a global division of labor between the wealthy countries or certain breadbasket regions. And of course, this is in the news at the moment with Ukraine and Russia being those breadbasket regions. And, I kind of said in my book, I mean, I didn't predict the Ukraine war, but I did say, it's not a good idea to place, all our eggs in this basket of this small number of breadbasket regions. I mean, the North American, prairies is another example. So, these crops are produced very cheaply using, to some extent, explicit government subsidies and the implicit subsidy of cheap fossil fuels. That undermines more local, small scale, if you like, more peasant agricultures with a wider range of crops, even staple crops, potatoes, cassava, plantains, yams, whatever, people get pushed out of that kind of local livelihood making. And then they're sort of on the dictates of the global market. Maybe they stay in farming and produce commodity crops, but if you're a poor coffee farmer, say, you're just incredibly vulnerable to the ups and downs of global coffee prices. So, my argument, basically the small farm argument, is that as communities locally, it's better for us to take as much responsibility as we can for producing our food locally, because nobody else cares about us as much as we do in our own communities. And also, we see the consequences of our actions. If you buy, cheap bread or whatever in the shops, you don't know where it came from, who produced it, what were the labor conditions, what were the ecological conditions of that production. Whereas, the more that either you yourself personally or your community is taking responsibility for providing for your needs, you're getting much more immediate ecological feedback about the consequences of that. And, that's part of the predicament that we're in globally, is that, we kind of externalize the cost of, someone else is going to produce our food. Some other region is going to take the ecological hit from how it's produced. And you sort of put that together globally over time, and you get into the, the predicaments that we're now in. So, that's a big argument, I think, for localizing taking responsibility, being aware of the ecological feedbacks and not making this assumption. We've had this whole kind of assumption that, get people out of agriculture, get people moving to cities, working in industry, that kind of worked maybe in the throughout, a stretch of the 20th century, but it's kind of hitting the buffers now. And I think, we need to get out of that narrative,
Yeah.
urbanization, industrialization, cheap energy, and into a narrative about local community making ultimately.
I like everything that you're saying because it sounds a lot like kind of driving a new form of responsible citizenship
Right,
through community and through producing one's own food.
right.
But I mean, given the urbanization of the world that we live in today, given the amount of people that are still flocking to cities, whether that's also because their land is drying up in the Middle East and on the continent of Africa, whether it's because of refugee crises and wars, and whether it's because there just isn't local economies that exist in very many places of the world anymore. And also all of these numbers are going to continue increasing because all these crises are going to keep self-perpetuating. What about land use? I mean, what is the difference in land use between industrial agriculture and small farming? How much land does a community need? And also does it not depend essentially on our landlords giving us the amount of land that we would need in order to feed ourselves? Like, what are the power structures at play that would stop it? You said at the very beginning, it's so hard to create a vibrant local food system. And you also mentioned power. What are the forces at play that are stopping this? And how can we either counteract it or go beyond it in order to be able to feed ourselves?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, ultimately, that ultimately is the critical question, I think, and obviously, the details are going to vary from place to place. I mean, one thing I would say is that, in many ways, small scale local production, in terms of land area, I mean, there's a whole debate about that and we can sort of get into the details, but, people say, well, it's all very well, this small scale farming, but it can't feed the world. I mean, yes, it can, and I mean, kind of your figure, although the sort of 70, 80%, that you mentioned, that's debatable, but, there's no question that you can produce, healthy diets on as much or even less land than than industrial systems. That the factor that's missing in that is labor, and people, it's this kind of weird thing where and that's that whole process that you were alluding to, urbanization and so on. It's this weird thing in agriculture where every other employment sector, people say, great, we've created more jobs in this sector, where in agriculture alone, people say, oh, great, we've got people out, we've made it more mechanized, we've got robots or whatever. And we need to get out of that mindset. We need to stop talking about labor intensive. And, Helena Norberg-Hodge talks about job rich agriculture. We need to start thinking about that. But you're right, this process of urbanization, it's been a huge factor globally, and it's kind of hard to reverse. Although saying that, if you look at the sort of the global poor and sort of urbanization in a lot of parts of the world, people are kind of stitching together quite complex livelihoods that involves having some footing in a rural place, family farm or whatever, but maybe moving to the city or moving abroad to earn money, sending remittances. Long-term sort of aim is maybe to go back to the farm and sort of have some money to, so, the sort of processes are quite complex, but you're right, there's a lot of climate displacement, but ultimately there's a lot of, it is about the power relations that you mentioned, and the extractivism and the way that, our systems basically, extract money from people or extract, resources wherever they can. And that's, I talk about it a bit in the book. We have this, strangely romantic view of the way the global economy works in being a sort of competitive market, which is driving down price. Whereas, the way it really works is, powerful players in smoke-filled rooms that most of us never get inside, stitching up, how this works. So ultimately, yeah, here in the UK, I mean, in a lot of a lot of the global north, or just generally, you know, uh, well, yeah, it's kind of interesting in that control of land over the last 200 years hasn't necessarily been the way to get super rich. We've had this kind of industrial urban moment, but here in the UK, like 40% of the land is still owned by the old aristocracy. It's and
Madness.
a lot of the other land is owned by basically wealthy people. In the US, Bill Gates, I think, is the biggest owner of farmland. Here in the UK, it's James
Yeah.
Dyson, another big industrialist. So money finds its way to land, and that inflates the price of land, and it puts it beyond the power of ordinary people. So to answer your question, that I think is the critical issue. Really, is access to land for ordinary people, and I talk about that a bit in the book. The real problem is the accumulation of land, and there were sort of interesting movements in the early 20th century, like distributism, where the idea is to stop land being accumulated to make it available for ordinary people, and that kind of got shunted aside a little bit with the sort of the big political clash of the 20th century between socialism and capitalism. The idea that the sort of industrial working class would use its kind of industrial muscle to access resources, and we got a bit stuck in that debate. But really, we need to get back to this debate about access to parcels of land for ordinary people. And I can't necessarily sort of say in any, every situation is different, but ultimately, there does have to be political pressure on access to land. I mean, I'm involved in various little projects here in the UK, the Ecological Land Co-op that raises community finance, buys up land and tries to make it available as clusters of small holdings for people at kind of affordable prices. We can debate how affordable they are, given the nature of the economy, but we kind of need to decommodify it. We need to stop land, just being a commodity like anything else that floats on the open market, because it isn't really like that. There was Mark Twain, I think, with that sort of famous comment about buy land because they ain't making it anymore. Because land is a limited good. And because it's such a kind of stable basis for everything, as I said earlier, capital tends to find its way to land. So the key political battle, is to open land access up again to people. And yeah, like I say, we're sort of in, its early stages in that, in a way, because we've had this model of urbanization, industrialization, getting a better paid job, becoming more prosperous that way. But, ultimately the only prosperity really is in the land and in our communities, and being able to provide the resources that we need to live well for ourselves. So, that is the key political battle. And, as you say, it has its own local colors everywhere, but essentially it's about preventing extractive landlordism, preventing people just extracting all the capital they can from whatever it is that ordinary people are doing. So for sure, that's the political challenge of our time. And, intergenerationally as well, because, a lot of people of my sort of generation have done quite well out of, the economy generally and property markets. But it means that, young people just have, we were able to buy our little farm just basically on, having had a kind of graduate type job, living in London, moving out to the country. There you go. We could, we could buy some land. That if I was, trying to replicate that now 20, 30 years down the line, it would be impossible. So, there's an intergenerational injustice there that needs to be addressed as well.
It seems to me that this would be an increasingly steep uphill struggle, because land surely is only going to become an even more sought after resource, especially as food systems start to collapse.
Yes, I mean it is an uphill struggle. I mean that can cut both ways. our little local veg box scheme when COVID hit. Suddenly the supermarkets ran out of, the shelves started emptying, particularly of fresh fruit and veg. So, normally we get, 2 or 3 new requests of new customer requests in a week, and suddenly we got sort of 200, and people suddenly start thinking, oh, actually, this mainstream route is not reliable, and people start thinking about, local food systems. So, there is the counter that, that actually we can start unlocking some of these ideas. The other side of it, I suppose, is that, it's a really interesting one politically. We don't necessarily have a landlord class in the UK in the same way that a lot of kind of historic pre-modern land politics were, where you have a kind of, if you like, a feudal sort of system where you have a sort of warrior aristocracy that controls the land. There are people that control access to land, but a lot of, here in the UK, there's a lot of land is in the hands of, still relatively locally operating farmers and others. And so, the really critical question is, where they fall politically. They're quite geared to a sort of mechanized agriculture where they sell into wholesale markets. That, I think, is going to fall apart. Energy prices are going to increase. There's going to be all sorts of turbulence in those tried and tested routes. And so that creates an opportunity for communities to say, all right, of which farmers are a part, to say, all right, how do we actually secure our livelihood and secure well-being locally? So, I agree with you. I'm not saying that it's all just going to, the chips are all going to fall nicely into a sort of widely distributed small farm future. But, I think some of the sorts of historical, political and class conflicts around this are not so relevant to present times, where we've got a very different kind of social structure around the economy and around food. It's a huge disadvantage that we're so alienated from the food and farming system, and a lot of people have no idea about farming or where their food comes from. On the other hand, we're not in a situation where you have a kind of traditional peasantry sort of under the thumb of a feudal aristocracy. So, that creates opportunities as well to, to take that political battle forward.
Yes. However, I think you could argue that we are more likely to slip back into a feudal aristocracy than we are to create a new system that could be exported nationally or internationally, given the fact that 40% of the land in the UK, as you said, is still owned by sort of, the elite class, given the fact that people don't know how to feed themselves, given the economic, social precarity that does exist. And also, again, given what you said, these powerful figures in smoke-filled rooms. They just prove repeatedly how keen they are on keeping, maintaining their power and maintaining their resources. So I suppose my question is, like, what the ecological land co-op it's doing is fantastic. It's buying up land and then trying to distribute it, a reasonable, let's say reasonable price, or a fair, accessible price, more accessible for others, but without access to capital, i.e. without access to the levers that are the same mechanisms that have kind of propagated the system. How do we start to undo that political system that has kind of created this situation, especially, for my generations? Like, we do not have access to that capital. We cannot go out and buy land and just start our small farms. In your research, what are there mechanisms that we can use in order to safeguard our future in respect to small farming?
Yeah, well, we're starting from a low base. I agree. And I think I'm worried less about reverting to a feudal aristocracy, which I think, that sort of arises in sort of fairly particular historical conditions that we're not in. But I am worried about the guys in smoke-filled rooms. I mean, that I think is the is the key thing. Sort of not, and we are going to be. Already we can see the way that centralized states are, sort of trying to manipulate narratives around, defending borders, sort of looking out for the ordinary people. I think we're going to get more and more authoritarian, repressive kinds of languages about, So the key thing is to is to combat that. And I think, what feeds into that is this whole narrative of progress, technology, people getting richer, prosperity, which increasingly is kind of threadbare. We're sort of seeing the politics of that work its way out, in North America and in Western Europe. So, the first part of that political battle is to kind of call that out and say, no, this model that has been is kind of endlessly touted of more technology, more progress, sort of nationalist development is actually not working, is bankrupt, is benefiting the few rather than the many. And that, is then the opportunity to create, more localized systems. And, I talk about it a bit in the final part of the book, the notion of the supersedure state, I call it, where it kind of requires, I think as the power of the state, it can go different ways. This is not some kind of utopian vision about how it's all going to work out nicely in the end. It can go in some very repressive, authoritarian, violent ways, and I think it will do in some places. The challenge is to try and take it in a different way and to exploit the fact that the state can no longer sort of control all the, keep all the juggling balls in the air, or kind of put all the strings and keep providing the service that people have become used to. So the opportunity then is, which people are doing, communities are doing, is to say, well, this kind of top down model isn't working. We need to take, responsibility and take control of this locally. That gives opportunities to start creating, and again, the details, which I talk about a bit in the book, can be quite complex. It's to do with distributing access to land so that people, have access to small plots of land. So, things like allotments, historically in the UK, the ecological land co-op type model, creating commons to make better collective use of land. All of those things start to come into play when, the community feels it can or it must generate livelihood, but that inevitably will or potentially will create conflict with those larger forces and structures of ownership, and there's no way around that is going to be the conflict of our time, but it's going to be different, I think, to some of the ways in which we've sort of thought about the politics before of, left and right, or, sort of industrial labor, et cetera, et cetera. We're in a kind of different framework about land politics and the need for individuals, households, communities to produce livelihood. And that's essentially what the kind of political aspects of my book are about. And, I don't have a kind of I don't have a magic answer. And in fact, I think that's part of the problem that we've got into, that, whether it's kind of free markets or whether it's, proletarian struggle, some of our sort of modernist political frameworks have said, this is the kind of single key, this is going to deliver progress and prosperity. But, there isn't, we don't have those single keys. We have to sort of invent this collectively as we go along, which is where, I draw on, the traditions of populist politics, which, like all these terms, it can mean any number of different things and sort of tends to get a bit of a bad press. But, populism is essentially politics of the people. It's about creating alliances, that don't have some kind of single goal in mind, but, are ways of, people coming together to try and sort out how to create their livelihoods in the here and now. Or, I've mentioned other traditions like distributism or civic republicanism, so there's all these ideas that are, that are sort of deeply there in history. I think we are at this moment in history where we're facing much more serious, critical, global problems than have ever been faced before. But the kind of problems we're facing, have been faced by societies historically in the past, and there are resources there to draw from, but they're a little bit, outside the sort of mainstream political narratives that we're used to. So, this is a time to be looking at those traditions again.
I just wonder how different this time is also because of the last 250 years of industrialization. And perhaps we are some of the first human beings on this planet where the vast majority of us do not, okay, I'm saying that from a very global north perspective. Many of us do not know how to produce our own food. Whereas previously, peasant revolutions, I mean, these were the people that were working the land. Once they could, overthrow the aristocrats or the elites or whatever, they still knew how to feed themselves. They still knew how to manage that land. And then from having that very stable basis of the people are fed, could then had the sort of, the mental space to create new political systems, say. That's all a bit woo-woo, but it's essentially,
Yeah.
the point still stands. So, I mean, now we are at a stage where people are so disconnected from the land and from food because of the food systems that we've created. It seems like it's beyond land politics. There is also the politics of education. There is also cultural politics. I mean, how do we educate people with knowledge that has been lost and that so few have, especially when the political forces pressed upon that system exist in order to maintain the current industrialized system, which feeds into the capitalist economy?
I mean, that is a challenging question. I mean, I think the on the plus side, I think there was this sort of post-war period when it was very much like, you don't need to learn how to, you don't need to know anything about food production. That's all being taken care of. You get on and sort of, get your house and get your job and become prosperous. But, there is, I think, much more interest now. I mean, I've seen that in, being involved in the alternative farming movement in the last 20 years. There's so many more young people with an interest in food and farming, I think partly as people are switching on to how important it is in terms of the global crises we're facing, and also the fact that sort of mainstream employment, it's no longer the case that, farming is an awful thing to contemplate as compared to sort of making money in other career options, because those other career options are also, increasingly there's kind of enclosure, if you want to sort of use that word, across the whole sort of employment market. It's not just people losing their land. So that is changing, but and the other side of it is that it's not, it's all of these things, you can sort of weigh them up in different ways. It's not that easy to produce a livelihood from the land, but it's not that difficult either. If you're trying to make a sort of modern type of salary from any type of food production, you're really up against it. If you're trying to produce, enough fruit, vegetables, crops to live off, it's not beyond the capabilities of most people. You can learn these things. But
Right.
but we do need to, I mean, if I was in power, if I was in government, sort of thinking about all these crises that are facing us, for sure, we've got to invest in kind of practical horticultural education. People have got to sort of pick up these skills, and that's, again, going back to that earlier part of our conversation, the rich countries have, these very sort of mechanized agricultures, and we export, um, either the responsibility of producing labor intensive crops like fruit and vegetables, the things that we should be eating. We either, rely on other countries, where, the sort of relative price of labor, vis-a-vis energy is different, or we import workers, from those economies which are sort of weaker than the global north economies, to come and do the hard work, on our farms. But one of the things we forget, it's not just that those people, can earn more money in, global north countries. It's that they actually know what they're doing. They come from, Eastern European labor, for example, in the UK. People know how to prune an apple tree, or, they know how to, they basically know how to farm, and they know horticulture. And, it's absolutely vital that we, re-educate ourselves, about those things, which, is happening and, can be done. It's not the most, challenging aspect of all this. And, part of what I argue in the book is to break down this division between, the professional farmer. Sort of image of a farmer is probably a man sitting in a big tractor in an empty field, whereas, so much of the farming worldwide is women, producing for their families on small plots, growing a diversity of vegetables and fruit and so on. So, so even if you're not necessarily producing all the food, for your household, but, if you've got a little plot, even if you're just growing, a few herbs and salads on a window box, in a high-rise block in a city, it's starting to generate questions and generate, generate a different kind of culture around food, which is, what we need so badly. So I don't dispute the kind of urgency and the difficulty in your question, but, there are, there are alternatives, and we just need to accentuate them sort of now. Yesterday, 10 years ago, we just need to be doing that.
I wonder if there's an interesting sort of narrative strategy in everything that you're saying, which is that if people could grow their own food, feed themselves, it would grant them a certain freedom from the precarity of the current economic system, which is squeezing increasingly everybody.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that would be a way to sell it to people in a sense. We talk about folk going off grid, which is like, off the energy grid essentially. But if communities can kind of come together in order to produce enough food that can be shared amongst them, and that means that maybe not everybody has to work a shitty job, and maybe not everybody has mental health problems, and maybe they get to spend more time with their loved ones. A lot of the same um, uh, reasons for degrowth, essentially. Um, I wonder if that would be a way to get people on board in a society where I think most people are now waking up to the fact of like, oh, no, the system is quite literally rigged against us.
Yeah, yeah.
And I am stuck in it because I've been so disempowered and infantilized through my education and through what resources I have access to.
Yeah.
Food production seems such a fundamental thing.
Yeah.
Surely so many people would jump on board with that then.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I certainly, coming from my sort of very academic sort of education and background, I like your use of the word infantilized. It's like, not knowing how to produce food, or how a simple engine works or whatever, or, how to do a bit of plumbing or wiring, so it's been quite a sort of education for me, which I still feel on a kind of early stage of, and also, the food system, like you say, we are in this situation where people are paying through the nose just to get a roof over their head. And so, the relative proportion of the household income that's going on food has got less and less. And so then this becomes this argument for cheap food, but it's kind of a vicious circle. And so many people working in the global food system, whether it's as farmers or, certainly particularly in the global south, but also in the global north, or, all of these networks of drivers and food system workers, and the way that government government social security payments then kind of implicitly benefits the corporations that are underpaying people. So it's this whole morass. You're right, and I think that sense of autonomy, that sense of partly just being able to take whatever small step it is in your life that gives you a bit more autonomy, gives you the opportunity to grow some decent, healthy food, of the kind that is, it's horrific that, fresh fruit and vegetables, which are basically what humans have evolved to eat, is becoming a food for the rich, that the price of fruit and veg is, so we've got all this kind of cheap, food based on those few commodity crops that I mentioned earlier. So I think there is a narrative there around the food, and it does again have to be linked to the economic extractivism. Why am I paying so much for my accommodation? Why is there no access to land around here? Even in cities, there's potential for green spaces and growing food. You can't necessarily grow all the food that to feed everybody in the city, but there's a lot of sort of local politics of urban space that that can move towards food growing, which obviously the allotment movement in the UK was part of that. So yeah, I agree with you. A narrative of increased autonomy and sort of decreased extractivism. That's is the right narrative, and I think the wrong narrative is the one of progress, mechanization, robotic farming, brewing food in fermentation vats to sort of get us out of contact with being creatures in the landscape. All of those kind of high tech eco-modernist visions, I think, push in the wrong direction. But it is a big challenge because we are a long way down that route of urbanization and industrialization.
It's a difficult thing to wrap one's head around as well, because the other thing that it gets sort of classified as is a form of like regression. Oh God, we're gonna have to make our own food again. And it's something that I've spoken to a few people on this show about small farms and the necessity and food systems. And Jason Bradford a few months ago was like, go and figure out how to farm. It is going to be absolutely critical for your future.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, don't want to though, and I really it's something, for all of the things that I learned and for all of the wonderful people that take time to explain things to myself and to the audience, whatever, this farming thing is like, there's something so resistant in me to it still, even though I absolutely believe everybody that says they took so much joy from it. It does give them a sense of autonomy. They've learned incredible things. It's brought them close to their community. There is something about like the cultural narrative around it that for me is like, oh, I just want to read books and stuff,
Well, there's a place for
and so
yeah. Not everybody has to farm, and there is a place for reading books and farming. Which is I've got my books here and my farm outside.
Sure.
So
yeah,
but I think
it just
no. So go
sorry,
on.
but just on that, I think the problem is that we still have, I say we, okay, I know that I certainly still have this like peasant image of when people were having to farm for their land, for their food. And it was grueling and it was all day and you were a serf, Like, I want to see more out there in the zeitgeist about the fact that, like, really, if you're farming, like, yes, some days will be hard, but like, if you average it out, it's like, what, 4 hours a day?
Yeah.
And then because you're producing your own food, it's a lot of distribution and chatting with your community and like, building relationships and doing other things and having more time than if you're, working in the city for like Goldman Sachs or whatever,
Yeah, well, there's the epilogue of my book is called "Does Goldman Sachs Care If You Raise Chickens?" There's a whole little thing about that, but yeah. I think the two things. You're right. It's about narratives, and I'm not necessarily I tend to just sort of I have a sort of fairly boring social science background, so I just tend to sort of say what I think rather than spin a beautiful story. But I think there is a beautiful story that can be spun. But you're right, the two aspects of this are firstly the narrative of progress, which I think is a really it's a really iniquitous one. Like the point of this is not to go back, to some idyllic image of a golden past. The point is to develop agricultures that deal with the problems that we've got today. But if we can sort of get over ourselves a bit and not think of ourselves as these sort of, wonderful, most evolved versions of humanity, we can look back to historic agricultures of the past, because people solved then problems that we face now, which is how to generate a livelihood in a sort of low impact, low energy input way. And, most parts of the world have developed an agriculture that, mixes sort of grass, livestock, cropland, woodland in, really clever, sophisticated ways. And I think we do them a disservice by kind of saying, just a bunch of old peasants. What did they know? They were kind of high tech systems that people developed that we can learn from. We don't have to replicate every exact thing. But, we can also, it does breed appreciation, when you see the systems that people developed and the subtlety of ecological thought that went into them. That's something we need to do. We need to re-embrace that local food culture that generated that. But the other side of it is also, as you said, that sense of being a serf, being under somebody's thumb. And that, which is true. But that's not really about the food production. It's about the economic systems within which the food system, is operating. So, it can be pretty grim. And it's all about the politics. And, there is this sort of narrative that, everyone hated being on the land and went to the cities. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, there are situations where people did hate being on the land, but also hated being in the cities. There's kind of economic extractivism and landlordism in the cities as well. So, people are always trying to make the best of things, seeking prosperity. Historically in recent times, the best way of doing that is getting away from the land and moving to the city. But I don't think that's going to be a long-term thing. But, it's not about, you have to become a farmer. You have to, produce all your food. It's just about, rethinking, where we're situated within that and what kinds of life ways, we need to create. So, I think both of those things are important, but, it goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. It is really, really vital that we don't become serfs. I mean, peasant is a term, I don't know. So I've kind of used it quite a lot. And sometimes I think it's a mistake, and there's a whole sort of, the whole kind of scholarly literature about small scale farming and ruralism in recent times has all been about, the demise of the peasantry, which, I don't think they haven't they haven't disappeared nearly as much as people have thought, but it does create those those wrong connotations for a lot of people. So, as I say, as we were saying earlier, the key battle is not to be peasantized, but to have rural autonomy, to have livelihood autonomy. Livelihood autonomy is the key thing, which people clearly aren't getting, in the way that, the mainstream employment, mainstream sort of housing sectors are going. So, we need to rethink that. But, it's not for everyone. But if you're not a farmer, I talk about it a bit in the book. One of the problems is that, I sort of use the notion of a symbolic economy. Money is this sort of ultimate symbolic. It's not a real thing, but it can draw down on real resources. So, there's a lot of people in the modern world who've got quite a lot of money in their pocket, which enables them to buy things that have, that have potentially quite negative ecological consequences, and yet they've got no capacity to, build up the ecology, other than that, people can do good things in their communities, whether it's rural or urban. But really, your sort of average industrial, your average urban modern worker, doesn't have much capacity to build up their surroundings ecologically, and that ultimately is what we need. We need people to be able to, either through the conversation or the narrative, or practically through their day-to-day work, to be to be adding rather than subtracting from from their immediate ecology and from the wider global ecologies.
And again, another really positive spin, I think, to put on that is that there's all this sort of talk of how damaging human beings are to the environment. It's like, actually, it's like our economic system that is damaging, and there's like a small percentage of people that are damaging, and it's our industry that is damaging.
Yeah.
I think that idea of saying to people, saying to communities, actually, you can add to your ecology. You can be a very beneficial part of your ecosystem. You are not a virus.
Yeah.
You are not a problem.
Yeah.
It's the systems that we've created that are the problem. I think that, again, is another narrative that just seems so necessary at this time when people are not only disempowered and disenfranchised, but like losing hope, losing will, losing any sense of capacity to do good for themselves or for the people or for the planet.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important narrative, and again, it's one that this whole kind of let's urbanize and let's kind of have industrially synthesized food and let's leave all of the wilderness to sort of take care of itself, is problematic because it alienates us from what we are, which is animals. Ultimately, we sort of live in such a kind of virtual electronic world that we kind of forget that that we're animals that need food and shelter and companionship, like other animals. And that it's interesting, that point, because I think I sort of touch on it a bit in the book, but I think humans, if we are inhabiting our landscapes well, we are potentially beneficial. There's the sort of concept of patch disturbance in ecology, where you get animals like an elephant or a beaver or something. That it kind of terraforms its landscape. It kind of it cuts trees down and sort of smashes things around, but within reason. That's actually beneficial because ecologies tend to they tend to sort of move towards a kind of low a kind of low disturbance, low productivity state. That if you kind of smash that around a little bit, it creates more opportunities. Creates more niches. It potentially brings more nutrients into the system, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that we've, as humans, we don't really know when to stop. We sort of, you can have too much of a good thing and we just sort of smash things around too much and, invent, synthetic fertilizers, which, I'm not saying there's no place for those certainly in the where we are in the world today, there is, but, we need to kind of place ourselves more in our local landscapes again, embrace our role as patch disturbers and manage woodland, manage grassland, but do it more sensitively than we are in sort of present global agricultures, and just sort of thinking that more is always better and productivity and progress is always the answer. But yeah, I think that's a really important point to place ourselves back as worthy organisms in I think Aldo Leopold, one of the pioneering US ecologists, had this phrase that we're plain members and citizens of the biotic community, and if we can get our heads back into that, that would be a good thing.
Wouldn't it just? And what good note to end on, I think. A very clear thing. Get your head back in the biotic game, everybody.
Right, yeah.
Chris, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you. I have one final question for you, which is, who would you like to platform?
Well, I was thinking, have you come across Simon Fairley? Do you know his work?
The name rings a bell.
He's just published a book.
I wonder if I have something.
Yeah, he's just published a book which is kind of a memoir called Going to Seed, and I've got an awful lot of respect for Simon. He's really done an awful lot of work here in Britain around access to land for low impact farmers and dwellers. He's kind of helped to revive the time-honored tradition of scything. I'm going to be doing a scything session here with some of the folks on my farm a bit later, with a scythe I bought from Simon, and a really
Awesome.
really good thinker about agricultural issues and how we can recreate small farm sort of communities. So his book is kind of an autobiography about his interesting life called Going to Seed. He's written other, really interesting things about sustainable agriculture. So I don't know if he would be interested. He seems to have a lot on his lot of things that he's up to down in his lair in Dorset. But he's a very interesting agricultural thinker.
I'd love to speak with him. Thank you very much. And Chris, thank you for your time.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. It's a pleasure talking with you.
If you want to learn more about Chris's work, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is also in the description box below. As always, a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community who make all of this work possible. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you next week.